I'm joined on the line now by Carter Hydrick, who wrote that book Critical Mass back in the 1990s. Hi, Carter, and welcome to the Politics Show.
Thanks for welcoming me, Tony. I appreciate the opportunity.
Could you just give us an idea of what first put you on the scent of this submarine? It was a Nazi submarine that left right at the end of the Second World War, but it was initially heading for Japan. It ended up in the United States with a cargo, we believe, of enriched uranium on board. But what first alerted you to this?
I actually started my professional career in the film business. I spent 10 years as a freelance filmmaker, writer, director, doing lots of things. One of the producers I had worked with knew I liked history and introduced me to an old German gentleman who had been in the German Third Army that was surrounded at Stalingrad. He was one of the barely 5,000 survivors out of 335,000 that were taken prisoner or killed. And we had an interesting discussion. He had found a couple of, I won't go into the background of why he was looking, but his family was asking for reasons why he did what he did. And so he went searching for stuff, and he came up with a couple of documents. Kind of one of them said that there was uranium on a U-boat that was surrendered to the United States, and the other one said that Martin Bormann was tied to that U-boat. And that's really all he really had. And they said, this proves that the Germans made an atomic bomb and that the United States stole it from them, and that's what we used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And my response was, at that time, the Manhattan Project history was really it kind of indelibly etched and still is, the primary history of the birth of the nuclear age. And my response was, well, you got two problems here. Well, we got three problems. First problem is this is really recent history, so it's pretty new and prevalent. Second one is just by nature of its technicality, its scientific nature, it's probably the most documented piece of history ever. And the third one is you've only got two documents, and you're not going to be able to change, what is written and endeared to so many people. Including me at the time, frankly. And my response at that point was, I don't think you have anything here. Where there's smoke, there may not be fire, but we ought to at least look and see what's causing the smoke. And before we make the film, because when we make a film, it'll never be, if it is true, it'll never be proven with the film. It'll actually debase the argument because of the artistic license that's taken in feature films. So I said, let me do a little checking and see what's here. If there's nothing, we'll go ahead and make a fun fiction film. And if there is, then this really needs to be put in a book and fairly documented and put up for critical review so it can be established as the real history. So that's how I got into it.
Now, this U-boat was apparently it's a bit weird because the enriched uranium is called U-235, but the U-boat is called U-234, U for U-boat or U for uranium. And apparently it docked at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Maine on the 19th of May, 1945, just after the end of the war in Europe, just a couple of weeks after, with 560 kilograms of U-235. You discovered evidence of an alleged synthetic rubber plant, I understand, as well at Auschwitz that devoured more electricity than the city of Berlin, but it never produced any synthetic rubber. So did you dig up any evidence that the Nazis had actually been enriching uranium?
Well, yeah, there's all kinds of evidence that they had been enriching it. The key ones are that, let me back up a step, there's two ways to make an atomic bomb. One is with uranium, the other is with plutonium. And the Nazis had made a mistake in calculating some stuff for their uranium bombs, and they decided to focus on a plutonium bomb. At least that's the story that General Gross, who was the head of the Manhattan Project, gave after the war. In reality, there was a gentleman by the name of von Ardena, a baron by the name of von Ardena. He was actually the guy who invented the first television to broadcast TV, which was at the Munich Olympics. And
The other person has cleared.
Oh, well, we seem to have lost him. Martin, we'll try and get Carter Hydrick back, but the implications here are that actually there were being deals, very important deals being done for this uranium at the end of the Second World War.
Well, it's interesting to speculate if that was the case. I mean, as you know, on this show, we have looked into what deals were done, particularly between Bormann and MI6 and the CIA towards the end of the war. And it's pretty clear, for example, when we see the former head of the Gestapo, Reinhard Gehlen, far from being punished at Nuremberg, he ends up running the German BND secret services at the end of the war. So it's pretty common knowledge that senior Nazis were integrated into what became NATO's intelligence structure at the end of the war. But the actual allegations that are made here are new to me. I'm not saying that I disagree. I would love to hear more, but we seem to have lost our... No,
we've got him back now.
We're back now.
Just to run through this article, which was in the Daily Mail and in the Daily Mirror in February this year, just before I went away for a month, so missed it. Anyway, secret files reveal Nazis tested nuclear bomb before end of World War II as Adolf Hitler plotted to decimate Britain. And I know Churchill was very worried that a nuclear warhead would be put onto a V2. And that's why they put a big priority on getting rid of these V2 sites. Documents unearthed in an American archive suggest Nazi Germany may have tested an operational nuclear bomb before the end of World War II. Recently declassified file APO 696 from the National Archives in Washington is a detailed survey of how far the Third Reich scientists got in the development of the atomic bomb. Now, hopefully, Carter, you're back again, but I know in your research you found quite a lot of files had actually disappeared, didn't you?
Yeah, it was really interesting when I went to look into Oak Ridge National Laboratory files, which is where our enriched uranium was created. You go into the archives and you go into the findings and you pull whatever documents look interesting. And when I went in there, I asked for 38 boxes of documents, and when they delivered them to me, all but 4 still had their classification seals on them. So the primary seminal documentation of what actually happened in the United States side of enriching uranium, at least, had not even been looked at by historians. I was the first one to open it, and in there I found the uranium production records and all kinds of records that spoke to a decidedly different history than what had been given at the end of the war. Which, was, you can understand at the end of the war with the Cold War coming and everything, you don't want to reveal everything. But now we're, 70, 75 years later, it's time to look at this thing for real and see what really happened.
And now, this most recent documents from this declassified file, APO 696, apparently it's the daily newspaper in Germany, The Bild, that dug it out. So this is actually some primary research being done over in Germany, that there was investigations, research, development and practical use of the German atom bomb. But I think the newest thing is that these various eyewitnesses saying that they heard that they saw the mushroom cloud. A German test pilot, Hans Zinsser, is in the file. He is considered pretty good evidence. He says he's a missile expert, and he observed in 1944 a mushroom cloud in the sky during a test flight near Ludwigslust. His log submitted to the Allied investigators reads, in early October 1944, I flew away 12 to 15 kilometres from a nuclear test station near Ludwigslust. A cloud shaped like a mushroom with turbulent billowing sections about 7,000 metres high stood without any seeming connections over the spot where the explosion took place. But I suppose the other implication of this, Carter, is that there was this potential plan anyway to use the nuclear weapons not just against Japan but also potentially against Russia too.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of... in my book, I cover several different kind of scenarios of what happened. It's important to understand that the United States was successful enriching uranium and was successful creating plutonium, but they weren't going to have either bomb before the end of 1945 or early 1946. The problem with that, for the United States at least, and all the allies, I think, was that Stalin had already said he was going to, and in fact did, declare war against the Japanese between when the Hiroshima bomb was dropped and when the Nagasaki bomb was dropped. And if you put that into a context of the military context of the time, he already had 1 million men on his eastern front with Manchuria and China. And within 2 weeks after he declared war against Japan, he took over that territory, which protected his right flank. He was moving 3 million of his 4 million man army from Europe, where the war was ended, to Japan. So you think about 3 million Soviet troops 600 miles across the Sea of Japan from Honshu, the main island of Japan. And if they could have jumped Honshu and taken over Japan, in a heartbeat, long before we'd had our nuclear bomb and ended the war, or been able to put an operation on Honshu with conventional means. What that would have done was change profoundly the complexion of the Cold War. The Soviet Union not only would have had East Europe, but they'd have had fundamentally all of the important pieces of the Asia-Pacific Rim, which Japan held. So you're talking Hong Kong, Singapore, China, Korea, Indonesia, all those resources and population. That would have made a profound difference. I think in my mind, that's the most probable thing that would have happened. There are some others as well, but the war planners had to do something about that. And when the uranium from U-234 came up, I think they grabbed it, they snatched it, and used it for their purposes to end the war, as they did.
How come it never ended up in Japan, where it was supposed to go? I mean, so that's where this U-234 U-boat apparently was heading. Why didn't it end up in Japan?
Because by the time the Germans actually had an atomic bomb, they had lost superiority in the skies. They couldn't deliver it to a strategic target without a high possibility that they would lose it. And there was somewhat of a risk in sending it to Japan. I think Nazis at the very highest level who created and controlled their bomb, used it, and there's ample evidence that this is the case, and I covered it in my book. I won't get into all the details, but they negotiated it to the United States as a secret part of Operation Sunrise, which was Allen Dulles when he surrendered, or he accepted or negotiated the surrender of Italy. That was part of that deal, and that deal allowed Martin Bormann particularly, but others, to survive the war and to maintain economic control of much of the previous German economy and help Germany revive after the war, which I believe is one of the reasons it revived so quickly after the war.
Now, on this U-234, sorry to interrupt you, but on this U-234, we're told there was just over half a metric ton of U-235, this enriched uranium. What sort of difference would that make to the ability of the Trinity test and the Manhattan Project to actually get operational bombs going?
Well, one of the things that you need to everybody needs to understand is that while the uranium on the U-boat is part of traditional history, and it's admitted to, there's books about it, the traditional history says that uranium was raw uranium and couldn't have been made into a natural bomb. However, into a nuclear bomb. However, and you look at the documentation of how it's stowed and the handling instructions and the fact it was labeled U-235, I've got at least five world-class physicists and nuclear engineers that say that was enriched uranium, it wasn't raw uranium. So that right there changes the fundamental truth of what that uranium is. And then the question becomes exactly what you said. Okay, so what did they do with it? Well, they used it we were way behind in our uranium enrichment. They used it to complete our uranium bomb, and the U-boat also had proximity fuses. We were having serious trouble triggering the plutonium bomb. And the proximity fuses, and there was a scientist on board the U-boat by the name of Heinz Zinsser, German scientist, and we believe he was provided the means to trigger the plutonium bomb. And by the way, he's a retired director of the nuclear weapons program at Los Alamos National Laboratory, which did the engineering and testing of the bomb. His name's Delmar Bergen. He promotes my book. He wrote the foreword to it. He's one of the 5 physicists I quote that say that my book is correct, that this is what actually happened.
So what was Delmar Bergen's role in the Manhattan Project?
He wasn't actually in the Manhattan Project. He didn't go to work for the Los Alamos until 9 years after the war. But as he developed knowledge and talked to these people, and through his own knowledge and understanding, as he read the evidence that I present in Critical Mass, he realized that the traditional history wasn't correct, and that I had it correct. The official historian for Oak Ridge National Laboratory for the actual uranium enrichment site, his name's Ray Webb. He also endorses the book and says it should be in every library. It's the correct version of what happened.
Now, Winston Churchill in 1945 was voted out of office, but there was something called Operation Unthinkable. He was actually suggesting, and in fact he had to be kept off the BBC because he was seen to be a little bit batty about the idea that it would be possible to nuke Moscow. Immediately he was into the whole sort of Cold War thing. So in July 1945, there were already plans apparently to launch an attack on the Soviet Union. I just wonder what you make of that, because it seems as if that they were instantly and rather too quickly after the Second World War, the United States and Britain, and thankfully we had a new government in Britain that wasn't Winston Churchill, embracing the Germans and the Nazis in order to fight Russia.
I think it is. I think all of those things are very, very possible and probably true. I haven't studied that specific area. I don't know for sure, but it sounds logical that, there was a whole large wing of the Allies, both in the UK and in America and elsewhere, that said, we're over there. Let's finish the job and go on, so we know we're going to end up fighting the Soviets. And I can easily see people promoting using nuclear weapons there. And with you, I'm glad it wasn't done. I think that would have taken us down a terrible path. I think as scary and weird as it was to have mutual assured destruction in the Cold War, I think that we navigated it probably better than what would have happened had the other path been chosen.
What about, you mentioned Alan Dulles briefly, what was his role in all of this? Because I know he was involved in Switzerland, for example. He would have been very much in understanding what was happening to the Nazi loot from the Second World War, much of which was deposited in Switzerland. And so what was his role over stateside?
So he was, he had a direct link. He was actually Franklin Roosevelt's direct link to Europe and the intelligence in Europe. He almost reported directly to Roosevelt, and not anybody else, as I understand it. And he, a little earlier in the war, I want to say later in 1943, a German who came to Dulles, his last name was Longband, according to Dulles, and he presented some materials, some documents that talked about a commercial exchange between Nazi Germany and other foreign countries, and they didn't get specific about it. This man's last name was Longband, and so I'm just going to leave that little pile of information right there for a second. A little later, not much later, a few months later, Dulles was approached again by emissaries from Karl Wolff, who was the plenipotentiary of Italy. Now, Karl Wolff had quite a background before he was plenipotentiary for Italy, which means he controlled, other than the military offensive and defensive, the civilian population of Italy he was responsible for, and the occupation. Prior to that, he had been in charge of the synthetic rubber plant, the building of the synthetic rubber plant that you had mentioned earlier, that actually never created any synthetic rubber, used more power than the city of Berlin. And there's no explanation for what happened there until you compare the characteristics of that plant with the characteristics of the uranium enrichment plant at Oak Ridge, and all of a sudden you see, oh, that's what it was. It was an uranium enrichment plant. So Karl Wolff goes from there to be in the penitentiary of Italy, and fairly quickly makes contact with Dulles and says, "Hey, let's talk about some negotiated surrender." And Dulles, the open story, the legend, if I can call it that, is that the Allies said unconditional surrender is the only thing we'll accept, and that's what Dulles supposedly told Wolff. But there's plenty of evidence that there was a sub-negotiation between very few people. Dulles, the gentleman, Dulles' right-hand man named Cyril von Gavernitz, and Wolff and a few of his close associates himself. And that's when Wolff, who knew was responsible for creating the actual material, German material for a bomb, took it to the United States and said, if you give us this, if we will give you this if you give us protection after the war, allow us to escape and give us protection after the war. And there's, I don't want to go down, get too granular, down too many rat holes, but there's a bunch of information in the book that backs that up about how when Wolff was interrogated after the war, he actually talked to Adolf Hitler about negotiating the secret weapon instead of using it because they couldn't use it after they lost air superiority. So that's where Wolff and Dulles plays in. Dulles is the one who headed on the United States side, the Allied side, the negotiation for not only the surrender of Germany's southern front, but more importantly, the surrender of U-234 and its bomb components that then, changed not only the tide of the war, the tide was set, but changed the end of the war and the players in the new world that evolved after that.
Yes, but there's a lot of people, sort of British historians, have sort of complained, I suppose, about the fact that we had Frisch and Piles, who originally developed in Birmingham the idea for the atomic bomb on the Allied side, went over to the United States. Churchill sent them over there to develop the bomb, but then towards the end of the war, there was an agreement saying, well, actually, the United States is not going to share any of what the development has achieved with the British, and the British were shut out. So, we developed our own bomb in the late 1940s and 50s. But I know, Carter, I think originally you wrote this book out in the 1990s, but you had quite a lot of trouble getting it out there, I understand.
It was, I think I mentioned to you earlier in some private correspondence that it took quite a toll on my life. Yes, I spent quite a bit. I spent 10 years researching writing it to begin with, as well as the amount of money I won't repeat here, but it was a lot. And wrote the book and put it out. I tried to get journalists and historians, professors to, originally before I even tried to write it, to get them to say, hey, look at this, and nobody wanted to touch it. They said, no way, that's real. And so because I made my living as a communicator and knew how to research and knew how to write, I felt like, there's a line in the movie National Treasure. I don't know if you've seen that, but somebody asked him why he's doing what he does. He says, if you know something's wrong and you have the capacity to fix it, you have the responsibility to fix it. And that was the attitude I took. And so I dug in there and started going after it, and came up with these revelations that really changed the course of history.
But it is in print now, so you've got a bit of a better publisher, have you?
It's in print. It's actually the first two editions were self-published because I couldn't get a publisher. I couldn't get anybody else to help me with it. Now I will say the second edition actually ended up on the physical shelves of Barnes and Noble, which it was the 13th or 14th self-published book out of 6 or 7 million at that point to actually reach the shelf. So it did well. And then when it went out of print, over the course of the next 10 years, it became kind of a collector's item within the conspiracy theory community, and copies of the first or second edition, hard copies, were going for $450 to $600. So there was people out there realized, hey, this is true. They want to get the book. They valued it, but it was hard to get. When the discovery of spent uranium that was documented to be left over from the Nazi atomic bomb project was made in Germany, it became obvious that I needed to update the book and put out a third edition. And so I put out a third edition about a year ago, and it's doing well. And fortunately, Trying Data Publishers published it so you can get this information out with the updates on it, for a reasonable price for a book. But it was a grueling, hard process. It almost destroyed my marriage and my family, and I had to kind of double back and put everything away after the second edition and spend some time healing some wounds. A little personal, but it's part of the process.
Well, listen, Carter Hydrick, we'll put a link up on our show page to your book, to the Trinity Day site. Thank you ever so much for sharing all that with us. And thanks very much for joining us on the Politics Show.
I appreciate it. Thanks for having me, Tony. Thank you.
Now, Martin, interesting story, isn't it? And I think maybe one of the reasons why there was so difficult for him to get that published is because the links between Nazi Germany and the United States it's almost weekly, we're seeing more and more evidence that there was a tremendous amount of closeness between the two. Really, in a way, starting with the attempted coup in the 1930s by Prescott Bush and the collaboration and cooperation, even in the 30s, between Nazi Germany and certain fascist elements within the US.
Yeah, and I think don't forget that this isn't just of historical interest, is it? I mean, I think Carter there, perhaps naively thinking that this was just 70 years ago now. Let's look into this. It's still live, and as I said earlier on, the evidence that elements within the Nazi state were protected and actually absorbed into the Western intelligence structure in the 1940s. I think that's overwhelming. The question is, how far did it go, and how deep did it run? And if the elements within the Nazi regime helped the West to develop nuclear weapons as part of a deal to protect themselves, that would fit in with what we know about other things that went on.
Interesting, too, that Deputy Director of the Los Alamos, Delmar Bergen, Dr. Delmar Bergen, has endorsed his book. Yeah,
but as you pointed out, Bergen wasn't there at the time. But nevertheless, he's a nuclear scientist, presumably of some standing. Otherwise, he wouldn't be working at Los Alamos.
Deputy Director of Los Alamos, and has written the foreword to his book. I just also wonder what you make of these claims that we had the Nazis had a 9-month lead on the United States developing nuclear weapons.
Well, I mean, that begs the question, why didn't they use them? But it could well be, as we're discovering.
Well, as he said there, first of all, he said they didn't have a delivery system, although they did have the V2. They may have decided to use their atomic bomb as a kind of bargaining chip.
Yeah, well, somebody decided to use it as a bargaining chip, because, of course, what the Nazis could have done if they'd got a bomb, packed it onto a V2, they could have nuked Britain, but they couldn't nuke the United States of America. And the United States of America would still be there, the biggest power on the planet, etc. It wouldn't win the war for them, would it? It just wasn't big enough. So you could see why elements within the Nazi state might say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to do a deal with the elements within the Western establishment with whom we've already got contacts going back to the 1930s.
Also, interesting what he was saying about, on the surface, it being unconditional surrender, and yet at the same time, amongst a handful of people, deals were being done.
Yeah, well, I mean, that fits in what we've been saying about Martin Bormann escaping from Berlin. He was, as far as we know, rescued by a British squad, Royal Navy squad, led by John Ainsworth Davis. And I think that's because the Nazis themselves were not all in on the deal. It's quite likely that Bormann was double-crossing his boss Hitler by doing this deal. And that Hitler would have probably wanted to fight to the end with a nuclear bomb and all the rest of it. But, of course, others had a more kind of self-preservationary attitude.
Getting bigger by being better. The #1 choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.